welcome to the Keys to Therapy. I'm Samantha, a licensed therapist, and I'm here to teach therapists what you didn't learn in grad school. So today's episode, I'm going to cover how to handle outside supervision. So sort of the pros and cons of inside supervision, meaning supervision at the place that you're employed while you're getting your hours as an associate, provisionally licensed therapist, resident, whatever your state or your licensure path calls it. Or if you decide to do outside supervision, so supervisors that you would pay that do not work in the same building that you work in. So clinical supervision is really important to your growth as a therapist. Once you graduate and you're kind of out of that bubble of grad school, supervision is basically like the closest thing that you have to maintaining that type of bubble, right? Like that type of support and ability to be really open and talk about whatever it is that you're needing help with or you're going through. So you may go from an entire cohort, professors, supervisors, to then one supervisor once you're getting those hours. And that transition in itself can be scary at times because you have this entire system and then now it's down to one person potentially. But it's also tough because that's where you're doing the actual work, because now you have some sort of version of a license, you are working towards full licensure, and you're typically having way more contact with clients. So it's a very tricky, anxiety-inducing, maybe like panic-inducing time in your career. That's why I wanted to dive in a little bit more to this aspect of supervision. I know I did another episode all about how to handle clinical supervision, how to get the most out of it, and red flags and stuff to look for. But I've seen this question come up quite a bit for people in some of the different like spaces that I've been in where therapists are. And I've also had this issue come up with some friends. So I just wanted to make a separate, quick to the point episode about this in particular. So what are the pros and cons of supervision? So first, we're going to go into the pros of in-house supervision, meaning you got a job and part of your salary essentially is that there's an on-site supervisor. This is what I had at my first job after graduation. I worked in community mental health, and there was two sections. It was a mental health section and a substance abuse section. And I was on the mental health section, and the supervisor of that department was my clinical supervisor as well. I was very lucky because I loved her. She was so nice. She was very understanding. At one point, maybe a few months in, something like that, we all moved offices, and I was able to move to the office right next to her. So it was so convenient to have her right there. And I really felt a lot of respect in that relationship. And I was glad that I had an on-site supervisor because it went so well. Also at that point, my salary was like $36,500, so $36,500. And I was living in Charlotte, and I was living on my own, and that really wasn't a lot of money. It averaged to like $2,000 a month that I was taking home. And I want to say my rent was like, if I rent and all of my bills, because again, it was just me living by myself, was probably around like $1,200, maybe even like $1,400. So yeah, I only had a couple hundred to buy groceries, go out to eat, like gas, whatever else I decided to do. Not so great, but part of the lower pay was that supervision was included, was kind of how I was sold on it. So the pros of having an in-house supervisor would be that it's often free because you're getting a lower salary, but you would have spent the money on supervision anyway. So sometimes it's a really good perk, especially if you have a ton of bills, if you have a lot of debt, if you know that financially you're already strapped to begin with. Sometimes it's nice to have an on-site supervisor where it's not any extra money. It's just convenient. The other pro of having an on-site supervisor is, like I said, the actual like location convenience. If I had a tough session and I was like, oh my gosh, I just need to talk for like 2 minutes about something that just happened, or I've got this client coming in later today and they're a kid and I don't really have any materials for them. Is there anything that you have or you'd recommend? Really quick to the point, like, cool, here's this pack of Uno cards. Here's 2 different strategies I use with kids with them. And you could just borrow stuff because she was right there. So that was really helpful. Big pro. If there was a crisis situation, I know one time I had a family session that was so loud with all of the screaming. And like I said, she was in the office next door that she knocked on the door and then opened it to make sure that I was okay because they were screaming so loud at each other. And that was nice. It was comforting for me to know that somebody was checking on me. And yeah, other coworkers would too, but it was nice to know that like my supervisor was right there and could do that for me. And I could also debrief after for a minute and be like, whew, I am so sorry that they were screaming like that. And for her to be like, no, let's talk really quick. How'd you handle it? And, be able to get like that immediate feedback was really nice. So lots of pros to in-house supervision. That's also extremely dependent on who the supervisor is. So keep that in mind for the next one. The other piece that's a pro of in-house supervision is she knew my schedule. She could see it. So being able to have a consistent supervision time was great because we would schedule it. And every week at this specific block was my supervision time with her. And that meant that everybody knew at the place that that's when I was meeting with her. And so nobody would ever book anything in that time period, which was really great. Also, we were able to have on-site group supervision because there were 2 other people there who were getting their hours as well. And group supervision was cool because then it was, all right, we're all here. We kind of see each other in the halls and stuff like that. But now we get this designated time to talk about what's going on. So definitely some really good pros to on-site supervision. Now the cons. And again, this is very dependent on who the supervisor is. But if you are being supervised, clinically supervised by somebody that is the department head or the supervisor of the place or manager, whatever role that is of the place you're at, that is a dual relationship. And sometimes if the person that is that supervisor has some issues, those are going to come through in how they supervise. And if you have that dual relationship with them as like the place supervisor and your clinical supervisor, you're going to get those issues double time. And I have seen that quite a bit at places that I've been and stories that I've heard. So what that means is if sometimes the supervisor may have different motivations possibly. So I know for my supervisor, for her to kind of keep the mental health part going because she had a practice that joined this facility that was primarily substance abuse. So she was the head of all of mental health for them, but she was also the program starter. So there was a little bit more pressure on her, I think. They really wanted us, they meaning like the big people in the agency, really wanted us to hit a certain number of clients per week to prove that we were valuable and that we were doing the work we were supposed to be doing and that money was coming into the place. So there was a big emphasis on productivity. If she had issues with that, if she had a lot of anxiety, if she lacked confidence, whatever it is, she could have really come down on us hard about that. And now our supervision would have been geared potentially more towards productivity than clinical skills because of her dual role. She did a great job with being able to separate that, but not everybody can. And again, I've seen this in places that I've been. Sometimes that role as the business owner, as the manager, as the overall supervisor can really seep into that clinical supervision. And now the motivation for them to help you, support you, whatever else, can take a turn. So just be very mindful of the roles your supervisor has within the agency or practice or wherever it is that you're working, because you want to know that they have your best interests and your clinical growth as the primary motivator for being your supervisor, not extra control over you or even potentially another way to manipulate you. So really keep that in mind. I tell everybody, if you are going to be interviewed at a place, make sure part of that interview process is that you're meeting your potential supervisor. because maybe it's the greatest place ever, but if you meet this person that's supposed to be your supervisor and you're just like, something's off, red flags right off the bat, and sometimes you don't know. But if you do, make sure that supervisor is somewhere in that interview process, because you really want to know who you're going to be spending that time with. Because again, supervision can be really vulnerable. You meet with this person, typically it's an hour, at least for mine, it was 1 hour for every 40 hours you worked. So 1 hour every week for the 2+ years that I was there. I met with my supervisor, and they had to fill out for the licensing board, like every 6 months we'd have to write up a case study, and they would sign off on the hours, and then they would also rate me on different types of like a different rubric: clinical skills, being on time, communication, all these different things. And that was what was submitted every 6 months as like check-ins to the board. So your supervisor holds a lot of weight and a lot of power. I've recently seen, unfortunately, a lot of people posting that their supervisors haven't been signing off on their hours, and they're holding it against them when they go to leave a job, or to prevent them from getting fully licensed, or just as another means of control. So you really want to know that you are not being held up in your career goals because of a supervisor and their issues. And there's a dog. But yeah, I think that you have to really completely trust this person, and you're going to be vulnerable. You're going to want to be in front of a supervisor that you can say, I don't really know how to work with really small kids, and I have one on my intake tomorrow, or I have an intake with one tomorrow, and I am not really sure what to do. So you want to be able to have those conversations, or to say, I'm seeing this couple and I'm completely over my head. I don't think I'm a good fit, and have them be receptive to that. And like I said, sometimes if they're in that dual role, they may be looking at, well, we don't have anybody else to refer to, or you really need those numbers, or I need you to have those numbers of clients you're seeing to prove that we are holding our own on the mental health side. So no, you still have to see them. Very tricky. So sometimes too, boundaries can get crossed. If you are focusing more on clinical issues and maybe they want to focus more on some other stuff, or if they've left like a bad taste in your mouth with supervision, now you're working with them still every day. Even if it's not in that clinical supervisor role, they're still your main supervisor. So just be very, very mindful of who that in-house supervisor is, how they work, what they do. And, like I said, I was lucky that it worked out for me, but I've heard very mixed stories from people along the way about how it worked out. So just keep that in mind. Now, on the other side, some people that I know have had to, or wanted to, pay for outside supervision. So what that would mean is that you do not have supervision at the job you're hired at, like clinical supervision, and or you don't want to see the supervisor that is there. You may pay for a supervisor outside. So this supervisor may work in a private practice, they may work in a hospital, they may work at a different agency, and they are a supervisor. So you maybe work in one place and see a supervisor that is employed by another place. Now, there's some pros of this one for sure. So one of them is that if you are talking to a clinical supervisor who works in a different facility, you're getting another perspective. So maybe you're learning a lot from the people who you work with like on a day-to-day basis. Even if there's like a main supervisor that you work with there, you can be learning potentially from them, but also say that eventually you have to go into private practice. That's your goal. You are going to do it. You could potentially get a supervisor who works in private practice, and they can also use supervision to teach you how to move that direction in your career. So if you are going for outside supervision, you can really pick somebody who either works with the niche that you want to work with, or has a specific training or modality that they really work with that you're like, that's what I want to do and learn from. Or they're in a career path that you want to potentially follow. So what's nice about outside supervision is you could be picky. You can really look at, where do I want to go, assuming that or even if it's just something you're like heavily interested in at this point. And that's who you can see for supervision. And supervision is definitely about your cases and stuff like that, but it's also about your growth as a clinician. And it should be about your emotional growth, your personal growth, your relationships, and your overall career goals. So I think it's really cool sometimes to pay for outside supervision because you can seek out somebody who either is doing or has or whatever else that you want. So that's awesome to be able to kind of like cherry pick who you're going to see, because when you have an on-site supervisor, you don't necessarily get to pick. There's usually one or two employees that are like the designated supervisors for the people who are getting their hours. So definitely a big pro. Another one is you'll have clear boundaries. Typically, if you have an outside supervisor, there's some sort of contract. On-site, not so much. So, or it could be wrapped up into your employment contract. Outside, you're going to have a contract. Here's the days and times we meet. Here's the fee. And here's what we're going to discuss. And sometimes that works really well. There's just clear boundaries in what that relationship's going to be. And I think that that can be very helpful, especially as you're a new therapist learning to kind of enforce and set your own boundaries. It's great to have that outside supervisor to kind of lead the way and show you how to do that. Not that an on-site can't, but again, it's just sometimes clear boundaries because you typically have more of a contract, like official contract with an outside supervisor. And another piece is that if you don't gel well, or you don't get along well, something's not going right with the supervisor that you are seeing on the outside, you can change. And it's a little bit less awkward because you don't work with them on a daily basis or see them. So that can be really helpful too. Now the cons of getting an outside supervisor. So one, probably the biggest one, is it could be costly. Supervision can be expensive depending on the location that you're at and depending on who you see. I mean, I've seen some supervisors charge like their full session fee. So it might be like $150 weekly for supervision. Now at a different point in your career, that might be completely affordable. But like I told you, starting out, I couldn't have afforded that. I was buying like lunch meat and bread and peanut butter and like the cheapest things I could get to eat because I just didn't really have a lot of throwaway money. It'd be like a treat for me to go through a drive-thru on my way home from work and be like, oh my God, I'm getting food. So, and that's literally like Wendy's or something. Like, cool, I spent like a whole $7-8 on food. So, good times. But yeah, you may not be able to afford outside supervision, or there may be a supervisor that you want that you can't necessarily afford at this point. So I would say to that, hunt around, join your local or state Facebook groups. Put out posts before you, maybe even before you graduate, if you know that you just want to know who are the outside supervisors you could potentially hire, and that you can hire. You are hiring them, you're contracting with them, but you want to know that you've got some options so you don't feel locked in as you're applying to jobs. So seek out those types of things. Talk to the school. Do they have a list of people that they recommend for supervision? I know that like the NASW has a directory for social workers that do supervision. So, look at directories, talk to friends, see if there's alumni from the school that you can speak with, or professors that maybe have relationships with people in the community, and kind of do some homework when you're looking for the outside supervisor so you can also compare costs. Another positive / negative, it's negative with the cost, but most licenses allow you to do group supervision, and group supervision's cheaper. So it may be $100 for one-on-one supervision and $50 or $60 or whatever for group supervision, because you're splitting the cost with everybody in the group. So I'm pretty sure what mine was. It was like 2012, so it's been a minute, but I'm pretty sure what my license here in North Carolina social work at that point was 1 hour of clinical supervision for every 40 you work, but 1 out of every 4 could be group supervision. So, and some don't have as strict of requirements. They just want you to get the supervision hours. So definitely look at that ahead of time, because if you're concerned about outside supervision and there's somebody that you really want to see but the fees may be higher, or it's somebody that you're like, they seem great, but even $75 a session or $50 for a supervision session seems like a lot of money when you add it up to being $200 a month potentially, then see if you can do some group supervision. Talk to the supervisors you're interviewing and see if they offer that and what those rates are too, because maybe if it's not as strict as the 1 to 4 like social work was at that point, maybe it's half and half. and you can do a lot more group supervision than individual, and have that balance both financially and experience wise. So just be really aware that to get outside supervision can be costly, but there are some options for maybe minimizing that cost or sharing that cost if you're doing group supervision. I guess another con too would be that you don't have that on-site person who maybe knows your clinical skills really well, because they're meeting with you in supervision. They're hearing about your clients and cases. If you just have like the general supervisor or department head or practice owner or whatever it is of the place, they're not going to be as familiar potentially with who you are and what you do and how you work. They also may not be as accessible or willing to be as accessible to you because they don't have that supervisory relationship with you. So if there is an issue going on, you're going to have to ensure that you're building those relationships with people who are on site, who, if people are screaming in your office and you need to debrief afterwards, that you can go to and talk to, because you may not always be able to call your outside supervisor and do that right then. They're just not going to be as accessible to you. So keep that in mind as well. Another thing is, if you say the place that you're at has on-site supervision and you choose not to use it, and I guess technically even if they don't, you're going to need to have most likely some sort of contract between your supervisor and the agency, practice, whatever it is that you're at, so that way everything is clear, like liability wise, clinically. So sometimes it's a little bit extra of a headache to make sure that you've got all the paperwork that is signed by your clinical supervisor and the place that you work at, and everybody's communicating and everybody understands the expectations. So it's not a big con, but it's just some added work that you're going to have to do to make sure that those relationships are clean and clear and are all working well and covering you, because it's really number one in this situation. There's really not a right way to do supervision, whether it's in-house or outside. It is going to be so dependent on who that supervisor is and also what you're looking for. So it's important to remember too, like assess all of those pros and cons that I discussed, but it's important to remember that you can always start in-house and see how it goes. And if it's not working, it's toxic, there's red flags, the dual relationship is really interfering with how you're feeling about work or your clients or the growth that you're able to have, then you can always switch. I've known people who have done that. They hit limitations with the supervisors that they had in-house, or the conflicts or red flags became too much and it was causing them to not want to work, not want to go to supervision. And you should want to go to supervision, especially early in your career. You're going to have potentially like lists of things to talk about. I know, like, I would feel like, oh my God, I need to prioritize who I'm going to talk about because I only have an hour. And sometimes you're like, gosh, an hour, that's like a lot of time to fill. But once you get talking and you have a good relationship with that supervisor, it goes fast. You've probably seen it with clients that you've worked with where you're like, some you feel that hour, and other ones you're like, wow, that's quick, I guess we're out of time. So you want that feeling with your supervisor, especially if you're meeting with them that frequently for that length of time. So yeah, just kind of consider that you can start one way and switch. It's up to you. You don't owe anybody anything. So make sure that you just kind of keep those considerations in mind. And if you're in grad school, then start before you graduate, already kind of building that network of who supervisors would be, so you have a backup in case you don't want to use the on-site one or there is not an on-site one. But I think also just understand more of what your expectations are for supervision. So when you go into a job interview or you're interviewing a supervisor, you know what you're looking for out of that relationship too. It's very parallel to the client-therapist relationship. You want somebody that you feel like gets and understands you. You want somebody that you can trust and open up to. And you want to have somebody that you feel comfortable with and you're ready to go to your appointments. There's stuff you need to talk about and work out. So have a little list going and interview them too. So like I said in the other video about job interviews, interviewing them is just as important as them interviewing you. So you want to make sure that you've got a lot of that stuff in line and already have like pictured what your expectations are going into supervision. So you're leading the way a little bit, if not a lot of it. So I hope that this video was helpful. I know it may seem like a random niche topic, but like I said, I've seen so many things coming up lately with issues with supervision or people just really feeling like it's not working for them. And this pre-licensure, pre-full licensure period is so crucial to your growth as a clinician. I mean, it's big. You need to have that relationship. You need to feel heard and understood, and you need to feel comfortable. And that's only going to happen if you've got a good relationship with your supervisor. So take all of those pros and cons into consideration when you're looking at your supervision, either if you're in grad school and you're going to be supervising. If you are getting supervision now, kind of reassess if it's working for you or not. Or maybe you're a more seasoned therapist and now you're the supervisor. Think through all of those things. Maybe recognizing if there's any dual relationships that you're starting to feel in your role as a supervisor and assessing that. So understand what your blocks may be, or if there's limitations that you may have in that role, or if there's, something going on that you can change or shift to make this whole supervisory experience better. So think about it. You want to get the most out of it. So, well, good luck. I hope that things work out in whatever stage of your career that you're currently in. And I hope that this video was helpful. So if you want to kind of keep up with things that I have going on, I have an email list that I recently started. So I'm going to be putting on in the future some different workshops, events, some new stuff that's in the works. And if you want to get first dibs on that, maybe some discount codes here and there, then go ahead and sign up for my email list. The link's below. Also subscribe to the channel. Help me out. And the more people that subscribe, the more I can get stuff out here. So follow along that way, and I'll see you next episode. Thanks.